Everything about the concentration camps was hidden carefully before the population.
She was Hitler's sister-in-law, but she wasn't in the bunker. Gretl Braun lived through the fall of a regime, the loss of her husband, and the self-harm of her sister. She kept quiet for decades, then died in 1987, never telling her side. Or did she? Whispers claim she revealed everything before her death. This is the story behind the myth and the woman caught inside it. If she knows, why would she tell the world? The mystery of Gretl and the final hours of Hitler. In the twilight of the Second World War, as Berlin collapsed under the weight of Soviet artillery, a chilling drama unfolded in the subterranean confines of the Führer bunker. Adolf Hitler, the architect of one of history's darkest regimes, faced his final days surrounded by a dwindling entourage of loyalists, secretaries, and guards. Among those absent from that fatal scene, but forever connected to it, was Gretl Braun, the younger sister of Eva Braun and sister-in-law to Hitler himself. For decades, whispers and speculative reports have circled around Gretl's supposed late-life revelations, tantalizingly suggesting that before her death in 1987, she confessed what really happened in the bunker. But is there truth in this claim, or is it yet another ghost story from the ruins of the Reich? Gretl Braun has often been relegated to the periphery of Nazi history, overshadowed by her more infamous sister. Yet, her proximity to the Nazi elite and her marriage to SS General Hermann Fegelein, one of Hitler's inner circle, places her squarely within the epicenter of power during the war's final phase. When Gretl married Fegelein in 1944, the ceremony was a grand affair, attended by top Nazi brass, including Heinrich Himmler and Hitler himself. But by April 1945, the picture had changed dramatically. Fegelein was executed on Hitler's direct orders for desertion and suspected treason, and Gretl, now pregnant, was forced to navigate the final weeks of the war in seclusion at the Berghof in Bavaria. Her child, born days after Hitler's self-harm, was named Eva Barbara in honor of her ill-fated aunt. The supposed testimony that Gretl Braun gave before her death has become the stuff of online lore, videos, articles, and conspiracy-laden forums proclaim that she finally told the truth about what transpired in the bunker.
But I don't look for the roots because Eva was mistress of Hitler. I am looking for mine.
These accounts often imply that the official narrative, Hitler and Eva committing self-harm in a final act of loyalty and desperation, is a sanitized version, hiding darker or stranger realities. Did Hitler escape? Was his self-harm faked? Was Eva Braun poisoned rather than a willing participant in the final act? According to these tales, Gretl, privy to classified information and family secrets, took these hidden truths with her into old age, only to reveal them in a late-life confession just before her death in 1987. However, these claims collapse under the scrutiny of documented history. There is no verified statement, memoir, letter, or recorded interview in which Gretl Braun confesses to any alternate version of events. No historians, including those with access to post-war intelligence files, Soviet archives, or the testimonies of surviving bunker staff, have cited any such source. The allure of a final confession may serve the sensationalist appetite of conspiracy theorists, but it lacks the bedrock of evidence on which real historical inquiry must stand. What remains more credible and far more chilling is the reality that Gretl lived out her post-war life in relative obscurity, haunted not by secret knowledge, but by personal loss, national shame, and the slow erosion of a world she once lived within. Nevertheless, Gretl Braun's position in history is far from irrelevant. While she may not have been a witness to Hitler's final breath, her experiences represent a unique vantage point, that of a woman who stood close to the epicenter of totalitarian power, yet escaped the flames, both literal and historical, that consumed so many others. Through her marriage to Fegelein, her sister's elevation to First Lady of the Reich, and her own silence in the post-war decades, Gretl became a symbolic figure in the effort to reconstruct not just what happened in Hitler's final days, but how those close to him chose to remember or forget the regime they had helped to sustain. This video will explore the truth and fiction surrounding Gretl Braun's final years, the role she played in the larger Nazi apparatus, and the enduring fascination with the bunker and its mythologized secrets. In doing so, it will separate fact from folklore, giving voice not only to the individuals who documented the final moments of the Third Reich, but also to the psychological weight of surviving it. What truly happened in the Führer bunker has already been told by those who were there. But what remains to be examined is why figures like Gretl Braun continue to captivate imaginations as possible holders of final secrets, and what that says about the human need to rewrite even the most documented chapters of history. Before she was married into one of the most infamous regimes in history, Gretl Braun was merely the younger sister in a modest Bavarian family, bride of the Reich and witness to collapse. Born on August 31, 1915 in Munich, Margaret Gretl Braun grew up in a conservative Catholic household alongside her elder sister, Eva. Their upbringing was unremarkable, though both girls showed an early fascination with photography and aesthetics, traits that would, ironically, bring them into the orbit of Adolf Hitler himself. While Eva's role as Hitler's mistress-turned-wife has been well documented, Gretl's place in the narrative remains more elusive. A figure who lived in the shadows of history, yet married into the core of the Nazi inner circle. By the early 40s, as Eva Braun settled into her role as the secret consort of the Führer, Gretl too found herself moving ever closer to the Nazi elite. In June 1944, she married SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, a decorated cavalry officer and high-ranking member of Heinrich Himmler's Waffen-SS. Fegelein was no peripheral figure. As liaison between the SS and Hitler's military staff, he operated at the heart of Nazi power. The wedding, hosted at Hitler's Alpine retreat, the Berghof, was a glittering Nazi social event, a bizarre semblance of normalcy at a time when the war was beginning to unravel. Hitler attended the ceremony personally and reportedly gave the bride away, underlining the symbolic and familial bond he felt with the Braun sisters. The marriage was less a romantic union than a political statement. Fegelein was ambitious and pragmatic, and marrying the sister of Hitler's mistress ensured him increased influence and protection. For Gretl, it may have represented social elevation, emotional validation, or perhaps even genuine affection. Whatever the motivations, the marriage tethered her fate to the collapsing Reich in a way that neither she nor Fegelein could have foreseen. But Fegelein's true loyalties were dubious. As the war turned decisively against Germany and Soviet forces encircled Berlin in the spring of 1945, Fegelein attempted to flee. On April 27th, he was discovered by SS guards in civilian clothing, drunk, and in possession of cash and foreign documents, clear signs of planned desertion. Brought back to the Führer bunker, he was interrogated and condemned by Hitler himself. Despite pleas from Eva Braun, who begged her lover not to execute her sister's husband, Fegelein was summarily shot, either immediately or shortly thereafter, in a courtyard near the Chancellery. The execution shattered Gretl's world. She was pregnant at the time and stationed far from Berlin, likely at the Berghof or in Salzburg. Within days of her husband's death, Hitler and Eva were dead by self-harm. Within weeks, the Third Reich was no more. On May 5, 1945, Gretl gave birth to a daughter, Eva Barbara Fegelein, named after the aunt who had died just days earlier. Her child was born into a world utterly transformed. The Nazi apparatus that had elevated Gretl and her sister to a place of privilege had now crumbled into ashes, and the Braun name, once whispered inside Hitler's private circle, was now synonymous with disgrace. In the post-war period, Gretl faced a difficult recalibration. Her associations with the Nazi leadership were impossible to deny, but she managed to evade the harsh punishments meted out to some others in Hitler's immediate circle.
Who was it that betrayed the family to the Nazis? After 2 years in hiding, her diary, published after her death, is probably the most famous first-hand account.
She was never tried or imprisoned for war crimes. Instead, like many who were not directly involved in the regime's criminal machinery, she was quietly allowed to fade into civilian life. She changed her name, raised her daughter, and avoided the public eye. There are few records of her life during the 50s and 60s. What is known suggests she lived with restraint and caution, perhaps haunted by personal loss more than political guilt. Her daughter, Eva Barbara, perhaps tragically destined to bear the double weight of her namesake and her father's shame, died by self-harm in 1971 at the age of 26. This loss, on top of Fegeline's betrayal and execution, and her sister's self-harm beside Hitler, would have marked Gretl's life with profound grief and quiet devastation. It is in this silence, perhaps, that myth began to grow.
Something you feel, but you can't explain by logical reasons.
People assumed she must have known more than she admitted, must have heard something whispered in confidence, must have carried a legacy too heavy to voice. It is the kind of fertile narrative soil that conspiracy thrives in. Yet there remains no record of any public statement by Gretl Braun before her death in 1987 that diverges from the accepted historical account. The supposed final revelation, attributed to her, frequently circulated in dramatized YouTube videos or fringe websites, remains unverified, uncorroborated, and absent from reputable historical sources. And yet, her close familial and emotional connection to Hitler and Eva Braun makes her an irresistible figure for those seeking alternate narratives. Understanding Gretl Braun not as a shadowy, secret keeper, but as a woman caught in the moral and emotional collapse of a regime she did not build but undoubtedly benefited from, helps us humanize a story that often drifts into myth. Meanwhile, by mid-April 1945, Berlin was dying. The final days of the Third Reich. Soviet artillery thundered on the horizon, and the streets of the capital, once the center of a totalitarian empire, had become a wasteland of bombed-out buildings, civilians in despair, and collapsing infrastructure. Beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a maze of reinforced rooms and cement corridors, Adolf Hitler and his remaining inner circle had taken refuge. The Führerbunker, once constructed as a military command post and escape shelter, had become the final stage of the Nazi regime, one of psychological deterioration, paranoia, and orchestrated death. Contrary to the melodramatic myths surrounding Gretl Braun's alleged final confession, the events that took place in the bunker are exceptionally well documented. Survivors such as Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, Otto Gunsche, Hitler's adjutant, Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, Erna Flegel, a nurse assigned to the bunker hospital, and even later Soviet investigators provided detailed and overlapping testimonies. What emerges from these accounts is not a cinematic mystery, but rather a slow-motion breakdown of a regime that refused to surrender, even as reality closed in. Hitler, once obsessed with his carefully curated image and authoritarian charisma, had by April become a ghost of his former self. Eyewitnesses describe a trembling man in his mid-50s with a shuffling gait, plagued by physical ailments, possibly Parkinson's disease, and mentally consumed by conspiracy, betrayal, and despair. His hands shook violently, his speech was often slurred, and he spent hours poring over non-existent armies on a map, refusing to accept that Germany had lost. Eva Braun, ever devoted, had chosen to join him in the bunker during these final weeks, even when she could have fled to safety in Bavaria. It was in this surreal and grim setting that the final act of the Third Reich unfolded. On April 22nd, during a conference with his generals, Hitler finally admitted the war was lost. He declared his intention to remain in Berlin and commit self-harm rather than fall into Soviet hands. Over the next several days, the bunker became a place of quiet madness. Generals who attempted to negotiate surrender were dismissed or threatened. Cyanide capsules were distributed, Children played in hallways. Champagne was consumed in whispered toasts. Beneath the concrete and above the gunfire, a strange civility settled over the place, more ritual than rebellion. On the night of April 28th, 29th, in a small and hurried ceremony, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in the Führerbunker. The wedding lasted no more than 10 minutes, attended by a few witnesses, including Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. After the vows, the couple shared a brief reception with champagne and sandwiches, followed by the signing of Hitler's last will and testament. According to Traudl Junge, Eva remained calm and affectionate, showing no signs of fear in the hours before her death. 2 days later, on April 30th, shortly after 3:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun took their lives in the private study of the bunker. Eyewitness accounts vary slightly in detail, but align in the overall picture. Eva took a cyanide capsule, while Hitler simultaneously shot himself in the right temple.
His beating heart was all to do with art, on which he had strong judgments.
The bodies were quickly wrapped in blankets and carried through a side exit into the Reich Chancellery garden, where they were placed in a shallow shell crater, doused with petrol, and set ablaze by Gunsche and Ling. The act was not merely a self-harm, it was a political statement. Hitler had long claimed that he would not be humiliated like Mussolini, whose body was mutilated and displayed in public. His final instructions were clear. He was to be burned beyond recognition, and his corpse never to fall into enemy hands. The irony, of course, is that the Soviet forces would later find dental remains and other clues that confirmed the self-harm, even if the absence of complete bodies fed decades of escape rumors and conspiracy. The events following the Führer's death spiraled quickly. On May 1st, Joseph and Magda Goebbels murdered their 6 children with cyanide and morphine before taking their own lives. Other bunker occupants, including Martin Bormann, Elsa Kruger, and various guards, attempted to escape Berlin in chaotic flights through Soviet-occupied zones with varying levels of success. By May 2nd, the bunker had been fully overrun. Its claustrophobic corridors were now a tomb for a dead regime. And yet, despite this extensive documentation, a portion of the public remains fascinated by the idea that something has been concealed. This is where figures like Gretl Braun re-enter the narrative, not through presence, but through implication. The fact that she was not in the bunker, that she was related to 2 of the most closely connected figures, Fegelein and Eva, and that she lived until 1987 without giving interviews, has led some to imagine that she was a repository of forbidden truths, that in her quiet post-war years, she finally told what really happened. But what could she have known that wasn't already publicly revealed by bunker witnesses, Nazi diaries?
I can tell you a lot of lies just to make you happy, but it's not true.
And even Soviet files, declassified decades later. She was not in Berlin during the last days. Her husband, Fegelein, was executed on April 28th, possibly while she was in late pregnancy hundreds of miles away. She gave birth on May 5th, 5 days after Hitler's self-harm. If she learned anything, it would have come second-hand, filtered through other survivors or sympathizers. And even then, the existing first-hand accounts are detailed, corroborated, and brutally consistent. It's worth examining why the Gretl Braun narrative persists. The answer lies less in her personal biography and more in our collective psychology. We are drawn to alternative histories, especially when they involve secret bunkers, powerful tyrants, and mysterious deaths. There's something almost mythological about the Führer bunker, a modern underworld where gods of war perish in self-destruction. To anchor a hidden truth to someone like Gretl Braun, a woman close enough to touch the flame, yet distant enough to remain enigmatic, feeds the human appetite for mystery. The ghost of legacy. The end of the Second World War saw the crumbling of Nazi Germany not only as a military power, but as a constructed mythos. The grand architecture, the staged propaganda, and the illusion of invincibility were reduced to rubble, both physically and ideologically. In the war's aftermath, the Allied powers embarked on an unprecedented mission to document, prosecute, and archive the crimes of the Third Reich. Most of the regime's top officials were either dead or imprisoned. Some, like Himmler, took their own lives. Others, like Albert Speer, cooperated with post-war tribunals and lived into old age. But many lesser-known figures, especially women closely tied to the Nazi elite, simply disappeared into the shadows. Gretl Braun was one of them. Following Hitler's death and Germany's surrender, Gretl Braun was not arrested or publicly tried. While she had been married to a high-ranking SS general, there was no evidence she had personally participated in any war crimes or political decisions. Her sister's marriage to Hitler, though symbolic, had taken place mere hours before both their deaths and was kept secret from the public during the war. Thus, Gretl was largely seen by occupying forces as a peripheral figure. In the chaos of post-war Europe, many like her simply blended into civilian life. Under a changed identity, and with the aid of her family, Gretl relocated and tried to rebuild a semblance of normal life. Her focus now was on raising her daughter, Eva Barbara Fegelein, born on May 5, 1945, child conceived during the fall of the Nazi Empire and forever marked by that legacy. The girl grew up in post-war Germany at a time when the nation was undergoing denazification and soul-searching. In such an environment, carrying the names Braun and Fegelein was a burden. The past, no matter how carefully buried, was never entirely forgotten. What happened to Gretl in the 50s and 60s remains murky. Unlike Albert Speer or Leni Riefenstahl, she never published a memoir, gave interviews, or entered public life. The silence was complete. She lived a low-profile existence, carefully navigating a society that was still deeply suspicious of anyone associated with Hitler's inner circle. Her daughter reportedly struggled with depression and identity issues, culminating in her self-harm in 1971 at just 26 years old. Eva Barbara's death was sudden and little reported, but it cast a dark shadow over the final chapters of Gretl's life. This personal tragedy likely deepened Gretl Braun's desire for privacy. The death of her husband, the self-harm of her sister, and now the loss of her only child. The weight of history was not just national, but deeply intimate. It is perhaps unsurprising that she chose to remain silent. Her decision, however, would ironically make her a magnet for speculation. In a world obsessed with secrets and unsolved mysteries, silence often speaks louder than words. Gretl Braun died in October 1987 at the age of 72, in seclusion and largely forgotten by the world. It was only years later that she was pulled back into the spotlight, not by scholars, but by conspiracy theorists, tabloid writers, and internet opportunists. Around the late 2000s and into the 2010s, sensationalist YouTube videos and blogs began surfacing with provocative titles. Hitler's sister-in-law reveals the truth, what Gretl Braun finally confessed before her death, or the last secret of the bunker finally exposed. These stories typically featured ominous music, spliced historical footage, and grave-sounding narrators, yet offered no new primary sources, no interviews, no documentation of any kind. In truth, the supposed revelation was never anything more than a recycled rumor, rebranded for clicks. Why, then, did this narrative take off? The answer lies partly in the cultural psychology of post-war memory. The Third Reich, unlike many other defeated regimes,
Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men.
became a long-standing object of fascination. Books, films, documentaries, and alternate histories have kept its ghost alive for generations. From The Boys from Brazil to Inglourious Bastards, from Downfall to endless History Channel retrospectives, the Nazi era has been repackaged into entertainment and mythology. And central to this mythology is the idea that we haven't been told everything. People are drawn to the idea of a hidden truth, something withheld by governments, sanitized by history books, or whispered among surviving insiders. Figures like Martin Bormann, whose fate remained ambiguous for decades, Rudolf Hess, whose long imprisonment gave rise to theories, and even Hitler himself, with absurd escape theories to Argentina, became anchors for conspiracy. Into this environment stepped Gretl Braun, a quiet, forgotten widow of the Reich, and thus the perfect vessel for speculation. Her very silence became a canvas onto which people projected their imaginations. If she said nothing, perhaps it was because she knew something. If she left no memoir, perhaps it was because she was protecting a terrible secret. This kind of thinking ignores the more likely and more human possibility that she was traumatized, ashamed, and trying to survive. Ironically, had Gretl Braun spoken publicly, she might have escaped this mythologizing. But history is cruel that way. Those who testify are picked apart. Those who stay silent are reconstructed. And so Gretl, who likely knew little more than what the world eventually came to understand through testimony and records, became in death what she never was in life: a whispered witness, a last link to a dying empire. Memory, mystery, and the ghosts of the bunker. History is not just a record of what happened. It is also a reflection of what people wish had happened, what they fear might have happened, and what they invent to fill the silence where certainty fades. Nowhere is this more evident than in the lingering cultural obsession with the final days of Adolf Hitler and the supposed secrets of those who surrounded him. That obsession has birthed decades of speculation, half-truths, fictional accounts, and conspiracy theories.
He stayed by Hitler's side until the Nazi leader's suicide in Berlin in 1945.
And into that tangled web has been drawn a relatively minor historical figure, Gretl Braun. Gretl's transformation from a quiet post-war widow into a supposed keeper of Hitler's final secrets is not a result of her actions, but of her absence from public life, from historical documentation, and from the narrative we've collectively built around the fall of the Third Reich. Her silence has been interpreted not as the privacy of a woman marked by loss, but as evidence of a hidden truth. In the absence of her voice, the world inserted its own. But the truth, while lacking in drama, is not ambiguous. The historical record around Hitler's death is among the most exhaustively documented episodes in modern history. Soviet forensic investigations, eyewitness testimonies from bunker staff, and declassified Western intelligence reports all corroborate the same grim account. A desperate, isolated man who married his mistress in the final hours before shooting himself as the walls of his delusions collapsed around him. There were no double agents switching bodies, no midnight escapes to South America, no cyanide swapped for sleeping pills in some last-minute betrayal. What happened in the bunker was ugly, pathetic, and consistent. So why does the fantasy endure? One answer lies in the emotional unsatisfactoriness of the truth. For some, the idea that Hitler died quickly by his own hand, as opposed to being captured, tried, and punished, feels like a historical cheat. It doesn't fulfill the moral narrative we wish for. In mythic terms, evil should be vanquished by heroes, not by self-destruction. This creates an opening for speculation. What if he didn't die? What if we've been lied to? What if someone, like Gretl Braun, knew the real story? Another reason is the sheer mythological weight of the Nazi regime itself. The Third Reich was not just a government. It was a symbol, a system of grandeur, ritual, and terror. The iconography, the uniforms, the flags, the rallies, was constructed for dramatic effect, designed to outlive its political use. In the post-war world, this aesthetic power was transferred to cinema, to television, to documentaries and popular culture. It was inevitable that the regime's end would be mythologized just as its beginning had been. The idea that the Reich ended in a dusty, concrete basement through poison and a single gunshot feels, for many, too mundane. In this myth-making process, Gretl Braun is a perfect cipher. She is not well known, yet closely connected to the major figures. She didn't give interviews, which means no statements can be fact-checked or contradicted. And she lived into the late 20th century, which places her within reach of modern media. Her silence becomes a blank screen, onto which conspiracy theorists can project whatever final truth they want to believe. That she never actually gave any such confession doesn't matter. All that matters is the suggestion that she could have, and that perhaps, just perhaps, someone out there heard it. This manipulation of silence is not unique to Gretl Braun. We've seen it with other figures. Bormann's alleged survival, Himmler's death being faked, even Hitler's supposed escape to Argentina. These narratives thrive on the premise that absence of evidence is not just a void, but an invitation. Conspiracies offer something history does not: emotional closure, novelty, and a sense of rebellion against authority. They tell us that we're smarter than the official story, that we're in on the real truth. But the real truth is simpler and more chilling. The Third Reich didn't end with theatrical villainy. It ended with a whimper, a broken man in a concrete tomb, his empire in ashes, his legacy inherited not by disciples, but by fugitives, self-harm, and survivors too traumatized to speak. Gretl Braun was one of those survivors. She lost her sister, her husband, and her daughter. Her life was not an espionage thriller. It was a quiet tragedy. In turning her into a symbol of hidden knowledge, we rob her of that humanity. We deny her the right to grieve, to disappear, to choose silence over spectacle. And in doing so, we reveal more about ourselves than about her. We reveal our discomfort with ambiguity, our preference for narrative over nuance, our desire to make even the most documented moments of history feel mysterious. So what, in the end, did Gretl Braun really know? Probably no more than any other close relative who survived the war. She likely heard accounts from former bunker occupants, maybe even whispered stories from other Nazi families trying to reconstruct their shattered pasts. But there is no evidence, none, that she held back a revelation that could rewrite history. If anything, her silence was a kind of final testimony that there was nothing more to say. As the years pass and survivors of the war die out, our responsibility to history becomes more urgent, not just to preserve facts, but to resist the temptation to sensationalize what is already horrific. The truth of the Führerbunker is not incomplete. It is simply unbearable in its banality. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that evil does not always exit with fireworks or final words. Sometimes it dies quietly, in a room underground, leaving only smoke and silence, and those who must carry its weight. Gretl Braun carried that weight, not as a conspirator, not as a confessor, but as a survivor of a collapsed world. Braun's life was not a missing chapter of history, but a footnote, and that too is worth remembering. Subscribe to the channel for more uploads like this.